For some artists, Kingston isn't the starting point, but a stop in their continuing journey. This is Kingston Live, and today we're joined by a singer-songwriter and multi-instrumentalist whose personal journey is as complex and layered as his blend of musical styles. Before arriving in Kingston in 2016, Michael C. Duguay had already seen success with several musical projects. After starting his career in his hometown of Peterborough, he began traveling, leaving his fingerprints on projects from the West Coast to the Maritimes, and collaborating with artists like the Burning Hell and Evening Hymns. But music is only one part of an artist's life. Dugay's personal challenges followed him throughout his career, eventually leading him to Kingston, where he spent the last 5 years healing and creating. He recently wrapped up a 5-day stint at the Grand Theatre as part of the local artist residency program. As one of the 4 local artists chosen by the city, Duguay took over the theatre to work on new projects and prepare for his return to live performance.
The audience in Kingston is incredibly supportive.
We're all sort of doing it together.
There's something in every artist that comes out of Kingston that feels like it's an outlier.
It is a strange and wild and wonderful place.
You're probably one of the most well-traveled musicians and artists in Kingston, at least that I've had the pleasure of talking to. But I don't think in all of our conversations we've quite got your full backstory, because Kingston is where you've decided to make your home, but it wasn't always your home, and it wasn't always mine either. I'm just curious what drew you to Kingston, and what did that journey look like?
Well, my arrival in Kingston was a total accident. It was unplanned. I'd been through Kingston a lot, over the years in my 20s, and had a lot of friends from here. But it was never a place that was necessarily, on my list of spots I might live, for no reason other than that I had just never considered it. So often is a place, and we know this living here, that I'd pass through on my way to Montreal or on my way to Ottawa, that sort of thing. But I wound up here in early 2016. To stay at a homeless shelter at the Salvation Army shelter and substance abuse treatment center, the one down on Princess Street there. And I was there for a 90-day program. And at the end of that program, sort of for lack of anywhere else to go, just decided that I'd stick around. And I've been here ever since.
Music had been a big part of your life before then. Mm-hmm. And music had somewhat of a role to play in how you arrived in Kingston, from my understanding, and I don't know the full story, but you had a lot of early success with some of the material that you were putting out there. It took you on the road, touring. You got a chance to play with many established and revered artists. How did that experience shape or change you?
I was really fortunate that I was sort of standing on the shoulders of giants for a lot of my early career. I just got picked up by older, more established artists when I was in my late teens and early 20s. And, I brought a bit of an instrumentation to the table that was a little bit different than other folks. I played a lot of accordion, and that's not something that, that a lot of people play. So I got hired for a lot of gigs, and ended up, at a young age dropping out of university. I think I did about a year and a half. And, the projects that I was involved with at that time, primarily, it was a group called the Burning Hell, who have a Kingston connection as well, that just started gaining some pretty substantial success overseas in Europe and Germany specifically. And I had the opportunity to start traveling and touring and working globally. And, what 19, 20-year-old rock musician's going to say no to that? And, I just jumped in, immersed myself entirely in it. In retrospect, without a lot of forethought, but, what sort of 19, 20-year-old is practicing that sort of, that sort of thinking with that sort of excitement going on around them. So I did that pretty consistently, playing primarily with them, but a number of other artists I played with. Played on the first couple of records by Evening Hymns, who are now based in this area as well, Jonas Bonetta. Mm-hmm. when I made my way out to Sackville, New Brunswick, I did a bit of work with Julie Duran from formerly of Eric's Trip. And then just sort of, odds and ends, this and that, studio work, touring. You know, I grew up in Peterborough, and I was exposed to, you know, quite a variety of approaches to music and performance, and you know, different examples of how sort of things can go in the business through my time in Peterborough. But Peterborough's a pretty small and relatively remote community as well, so everything was pretty parochial. You know, it was I got exposed to a lot, but there was limitations on what I was exposed to, and it certainly shaped me a lot as you know, as a person, as an artist, as a player. There was a real sort of folk and bluegrass slant in that community when I was a teenager, but I also came up in sort of a DIY punk community as well. And to this day, I think that both the sort of the folk music tradition and the punk DIY spirit is really foundational to my practice and just my life and lifestyle as well. And at that time, it seemed that, it's sort of funny looking back, but every band in Peterborough just had like 12 to 15 people in the bands. And so I grew up in, you know, playing in bands and seeing bands where it was just, you know, really loud, really rambunctious. I think things like taste and restraint came later in my music education than when I was there. And I don't say that pejoratively, you know, it was all a really, really great experience. I learned a lot about immersive collaboration and sort of widespread collaboration, working with all sorts of different people, and developed just, you know, a hunger for music making that, you know, although it had to be sort of put on the back burner for a little while, definitely, you know, remains to this day. And it took a pretty circuitous route for me to get back to the point in my early 30s where I, you know, understood finally, like, this is all I'm good at. This is all I like doing. This is all I want to do. Everything that, you know, working as an artist provides in terms of lifestyle and experiences, all the things I love most in life, spending time with interesting people, traveling, being creative, you know, it's all encompassed in that work and the work that I get to do now. Of course, that's been a lot different in the last year and a half, but so yeah, I played with a number of Peterborough bands, sort of, you know, Peterborough, Toronto bands until I was about 25. And like you mentioned, did some pretty, you know, serious touring at that time. Got to see a lot of the world. And then I ended up just getting, I developed a pretty serious anxiety disorder while I was on the road. You know, there's a much longer story there, but it was symptomatic of a more deep-rooted PTSD diagnosis that I did not have at that time, but I have now. And you know, the nature of that stuff as well is that when you've experienced trauma, that sort of thing, you repress it. And so I was dealing with the symptoms of a problem that I couldn't actually identify or isolate in any way, which became a problem when I was, you know, in Europe with a band with no health insurance, no travel insurance, that sort of thing. And it got to the point where just logistically, it wasn't particularly practical to have me on the road because I often couldn't leave, you know, the accommodations. I couldn't leave the hotel or whatever. So I came back to Canada, went back to Peterborough. And yeah, from there, you know, just did my best, I think, with what I had available to me to try and sort out those problems. But they just, you know, the nature of these things is that they spiral. And especially when there's an undiagnosed mental illness, these things spiral even more seriously. So I made a move out to the East Coast in my mid-20s, and basically from there just things spiraled more quickly. You know, I made a move from a community where I had a community of peers who knew me and trusted me and with whom I had rapport, to a community where I really didn't know anybody. And I was actually just in Peterborough yesterday talking to some old friends, and they asked me about this specifically, about my time in New Brunswick. And these folks I was talking to are from Peterborough as well. And I said, you know, Peterborough drinking out of context doesn't make a whole lot of sense in other towns sometimes to some people. And that was really, really it. You know, it's that community that I grew up in was so creative and so collaborative, and a lot of the time so sort of community oriented and rooted in that DIY ethic that I was mentioning earlier. But there was a lot of, you know, there's a lot of substance abuse around me, and a lot of the people that I grew up revering were people who partied a certain way. And I, from a young age, I wanted to be like these people that I looked up to. So I emulated that. Now, of course, I'm not pointing my fingers at anybody. I was definitely, I had it come in one way or another. But when I made it out to New Brunswick, yeah, sort of without any support, things just completely fell apart. And so from there, that's when I stopped playing music. I spent about 5 years kind of going coast to coast, trying different places out. Went to rehab half a dozen times. Found myself in all sorts of not particularly comfortable situations over the course of that half decade. And inevitably I wound up in Kingston in 2016.
You talk a lot about the importance of collaboration in what you do and your experience in collaboration, but it sounds like these struggles were rather isolating for you. As an appreciator of music, we often look at performing musicians and revere them, idolize them sometimes, and forget that they're human beings on the inside. And it sounds like that might have been a lonely time for you, despite all the travel that you were doing and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it didn't begin lonely. I think my whole life dealt with this sort of feeling of not belonging, not fitting in, this sort of stuff. Something that, you hear, this is pretty consistent across the board with people who live with undiagnosed mental illness, that you always feel just sort of just on the outside of communities or whatever it may be. And I think, in an effort sometimes to quell that anxiety, which in my case was, using substances, it would result in behavior that only increased that and made it real, sort of manifesting that stuff. So to this day, I need to really remind myself when I'm amongst my peers, when I'm amongst my collaborators, my community, my friends, my family, whatever, that, I belong here and it's good. They want me here. Everyone wants me here, and it's, it's been a long road to get there, but something I'm comfortable with now. But it was, at times incredibly isolating. And I can remember a few moments in particular, just experiencing just overwhelming loneliness in situations where I was completely alone. And then sometimes in situations where I was surrounded by people who had my best interests in mind as well.
Michael, you've obviously been through a lot over the years. We've touched on PTSD, on substance abuse, on homelessness, and we've spoken before, and I know you're in a much better place now, which is great. What advice would you have for someone who might be in a similar situation to the one you were in years past?
Well, I mean, there's nuances to these things. I don't know if there's necessarily any general advice that one can give that would, cover all this stuff, aside from just, simply the advice to reach out to folks who can provide the resources and support that people need when they're struggling with mental illness or substance abuse. I think that, not to paint with too broad of a brush, but like I said earlier, I think a lot of people who deal with this stuff suffer from this sort of feeling of, not belonging, which I think can result in this sort of apprehension or sometimes just ambivalence to reach out to other people for help. It can be this self-fulfilling prophecy of thinking that, at least speaking from my own experience, this, feeling like I wasn't worthy of the support sometimes. And I'm lucky that I had the privilege of family that stood by me. I have, the privilege of being an able-bodied white man, and I had access to resources that folks coming from other communities don't necessarily have, but there are supports in place for everybody who's dealing with this stuff. And I think the first step that anybody can make when seeking out help is to ask for that help, for sure.
Well, we're happy you're in Kingston. We're happy you're doing as well as you are. I'm interested in your perspective on Kingston as a music city, because you've been here a few years now, and we're all pretty deep in this. Like, I grew up here. I've lived here most of my life. Rob's been here for a while, but I think we're kind of too deep into it now, where we maybe lack some objectivity, about what's going on here and maybe what's going on outside. I'm curious what your thoughts are. What's your impression of Kingston as a music town?
I moved here at a funny time officially moved here in April of 2016. And prior to coming to Kingston at that time, I would come to town and I would, I'd hang out at the Goat. I would go see shows at the Artel. So there were these pockets of creative communities that I was familiar with, and I moved here just anticipating that those would be, that would be where I would hang out and the crowd that I would run with. And they had both, I think the Goat closed the day I moved to Kingston or something like that. So, the impression that I came here with, obviously is not congruent with the reality of what I've experienced here, just simply because those spaces are no longer there. Not that those communities dissolved, but of course spaces uphold communities a lot of the time. There are so many musicians, so many artists of so many different sort of stripes in this community, and I think that is representative of some vitality that exists here. I think that there's definitely a more subterranean community of artists here that don't necessarily always receive the sort of elevation that I personally think they deserve. And that's often the nature of sort of outsider art, right? And I don't want to suggest that, speak on anyone's behalf, because maybe some of these folks don't want to be elevated, but it was an interesting experience, and I should mention too that, I moved to Kingston and I was sober for a year, but then I relapsed, and that sort of occupied the following couple of years for me. So it's really only in the last couple of years that I even started playing music again, let alone sort of actively started engaging with the music community. And then of course COVID came along and really changed that. I think that not being from here, maybe I don't identify with the Tragically Hip in the same way as a lot of folks do here. I was lucky enough to see that show in the arena. If I wasn't a fan before, that turned me into one for sure. It was a pretty amazing experience. But I think that, this exists in other places as well. I was chatting with a friend the other day who lives in Athens, Georgia, and we were sort of comparing notes. R.E.M. are from Athens, Georgia, B-52s, Neutral Milk Hotel, all these sort of great college rock, indie rock bands. And it means so much to have these widely revered projects come from one's community. But I think at the same time, that can sort of cast a bit of a cultural shadow sometimes. I think that the Tragically Hip, of course, I'm not trying to rag on the Tragically Hip here. I think they're just, they're the elephant in the room. I'm not going to talk around the band that we all know and love from here. And with all due respect to their artistry and their music, but sometimes I think that sort of retroactive reverence towards bands that aren't particularly active any longer can congest the channels for bands that are current and that are trying. And I think that, it casts a shadow in the sense too, that naturally they're like, I was discussing this earlier. I did the same thing when I was from Peterborough. Young artists want to emulate these sorts of bands. They want to follow that arc of that professional arc and towards the same sort of success that they have. And I think one of the most incredible things about the Tragically Hip is that they're one in a million. They're an enigma. That's lightning in a bottle, and I don't think anyone else is going to catch it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it can create a sort of insularity, and it can threaten to make a cultural community sort of, vacuous sometimes. And I don't think that is always happening here all the time, but it's something that I've noticed. And I've had fun while I've been here slowly finding artists and musicians to work with or just be friends with or just to admire from a distance, whatever it may be. There's all sorts of stuff here, but I think there's a certain sort of status quo that rises to the surface more frequently than others.
I like what you said, and I agree that sometimes I think maybe there's a little too much reverence and attention on the Tragically Hip and maybe some other older, more established bands. And something I wanted to talk to the both of you about is, and sort of expanding on what we're talking about already, is this idea of Kingston being a music capital. And Rob and I came up with this phrase of the first capital of Canadian music, which is true to a certain extent, but it's also a bit aspirational as well. And that's been kind of the mission of the podcast since the start, is to kind of elevate all this talent that exists in the city. And I want to talk to the both of you about what you think of Kingston's current sort of status as a music town and where it's going and what we can do with it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we started the podcast for the same reason that Michael's talking about. When we all know, love, and respect the Tragically Hip for their contributions to many different things, including music and the city itself, Kingston, their hometown. but they overshadow the accomplishments of many, many other artists that Kingston has produced. And I think that's really where our conversation started around Kingston Live, was that the city has produced many more successful artists, and successful domestically and internationally, than the Tragically Hip. And so you start thinking like, wow, what's in the water here? And so, yeah, it's, for that reason, I think what we were trying to do with Kingston Live was to really crack the city open and expose the citizens who call Kingston home, and the rest of Canada, maybe the rest of the world, what's really inside here. That was really the impetus for what we're doing here.
Yeah, I think that's a really, the spirit of that vision is really powerful and strong. And I think that, for me personally, I mean, I'm not an expert by any stretch, I haven't lived here for long enough to have, I think, a voice that matters as much as others. But I think that if we're going to crack it open and look at what are the inner workings of this music scene, and what creates sort of generation after generation of very ambitious artists, I think it's important to sort of identify, well, what's not here? And in the pursuit of that aspiration, saying, considering what needs to be in place. And I think that it's good and fine, and I mean this with all due respect, it's good and fine to anoint a community the capital of the music capital of Canada. But I would ask some questions like, what resources are in place here to truly support musicians? Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that there's less resources here than elsewhere, but elsewhere isn't Canada's music capital in this conversation, at least. So, the same question gets asked in Peterborough: what's in the water? Serena Ryder, Neil Young, Washboard Hank, all these folks came out of there as well. And there were initiatives while I grew up there and was working there to sort of claim that title as well. But at that time, I don't think, there were certainly pockets of people who were trying to expose that's the word I'm looking for. Just exposing what was lacking in terms of infrastructure to actually support artists. I think if you look at music capitals, say Austin, Texas, you can register with the municipality of Austin, Texas, and you get health benefits if you're a musician. If you can demonstrate that you're a working musician, you get health benefits. You belong to a union. And I don't think that's necessarily the first step, is to instigate health benefits for everybody, every working musician in Kingston. And then, of course, it gets complicated. Well, how do you determine who's a working musician and who's a Sunday painter, that sort of thing? But that's a wonderful aspiration. I think that if the city, wants to market itself this way, and if the city wants to essentially take this great idea that you two came up with and promote it in that way, then maybe they should consider, having a medium-sized music venue that's accessible financially, physically, that has a working PA and trained technicians, and that isn't, food and beverage oriented.
Yeah, that's been the thing. We've talked before about how the Kingston music scene is more or less a bar scene, mm-hmm. to a certain degree.
I think it's exclusively a bar scene.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked before too about how there's this divide, there's this gap between kind of the mainstream, or even the intelligentsia, mm-hmm. If you will, between that and between the sort of grassroots music community. Mm-hmm. And I think we've been trying to serve as a kind of bridge between the two, but obviously we can't do that on our own. Mm-hmm. There needs to be some help. And I think we've seen a little bit of that maybe in the last couple of years, especially during COVID. We've seen, the municipality, we've seen, the more mainstream arts community kind of getting involved. But it's a question, I think, of, is it enough? Is it gestural, or do they really believe that there's something here worth nurturing and growing?
Yeah, and I think the question is, do they believe there's something here worth nurturing and growing, or do they believe there's something here that's simply worth commodifying, creating a marketing campaign around and trying to bring tourists through, right?
Yeah. Well, even that would be fine too, and we've talked about that in the past. Rob has charts. He's he's always talking about the music economy, and building it as a financial pillar in the community. Yeah,
well, I think Kingston has a music economy, and I don't think it's been anatomically dissected or looked at, or in the ways that would allow people to spot the opportunities to make it better. I do know that finally, it seems like the creative industries, and that includes music, are becoming a priority for the city. I think being an outsider and coming from a place like Toronto and seeing this special thing that Kingston has in its music economy, it seemed very obvious to me that there was something here that was worth investing in. But I guess it takes a while for others to recognize that, but it seems like recognition is starting to happen. And I think there has been some interesting experiments taking place. You were part of one of those experiments with the...
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that too, yeah.
You recently completed... you were one of the very first handful of artists. Yeah, you were actually the first to participate in a pilot for a residency program at Kingston's the Grand Theatre. And we wanted to get the scoop on that. Last time we talked was just before you were heading into that. And right, so... Yeah. I wanted to hear about your experience and what you feel you accomplished and how it all went.
Yeah, well, first I think just to connect that to what we were just discussing, you referenced investment, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. If we want to develop and nurture a music community that in real time supports artists, and I mean supports artists in a way that they don't have to, constantly be living under the threat of like, do I have to go get a day job again, which can be really suffocating as an artist. It takes money. It comes down to money. I identify as an anti-capitalist, but we live in a society that requires money to stay alive and to keep communities alive. So this residency program that the city began this season, which, as I understand it, was born out of COVID. And because of COVID, the theater sitting empty for a year and a half, and administrators at the city thinking that it'd be great to have artists in there. I think it's a good example of a small step towards that sort of thing, where they're essentially donating resources and providing a bit of a stipend to local artists to work on their craft in an uninterrupted, immersive way, which is huge. That's huge, and for me, it was huge. So yeah, I did the residency 3 weeks ago.
I'm sorry, can you explain just a little more about what the residency is? Because I was confused about this before. Because when I hear residency, I think of like a regular performing gig at an establishment, but it's a little different than that.
Yeah, so this is more, what they're doing resembles more of a traditional artist residency, where basically a space and resources are provided to an artist to go and immerse themselves in that space with those resources to work on their practice during that time without necessarily any sort of product in mind at the end of it. I think some residencies, require or encourage some sort of, final product. But in this case, that wasn't the vision. And I'm grateful for that, because I think that sort of thing is not necessarily very healthy. I did there for a week what I normally do at home, but I did it on a Steinway grand piano with a full PA, a dedicated technician.
You were the first person to use that piano in like a year and a half or something.
Yeah, a year and a half. It was incredible. Yeah, it was really cool, and I felt that while I was in there. It felt significant. So yeah, I just did, like I said, what I normally do at home. I spent my time. It was sort of project oriented in that I am a musician who releases records, and so I'm always sort of working on the next thing. I'm beginning a session in Peterborough on Sunday, and I'll be there for a week recording a new record with a bunch of some folks from here and some folks from Peterborough and a few from elsewhere. So that was a body of work that I was trying to refine while I was there. It was mostly done, but it was a great opportunity to go in and sort of pull all the loose ends together and create a sort of consistent body of work. I got to have my collaborators in there, some of my local collaborators. So Teilhard Frost, Jason Mercer, and Liam Cole joined me while I was there. And it was great that the city allowed for that as well. The timing worked out really nicely with some of the restrictions being lifted. And in fact, the final day of the residency felt really, really uniquely special, because it was the day that Kingston entered the third?
Phase 3?
Phase 3, right, yeah. And so, like, not only did we get to, like, work together on stage in a venue, we got to, like, go out for lunch in a restaurant together, and then I got to have a barbecue afterwards with everybody, and it felt like, just for a moment, like a normal day again, which was really nice. And I'm not going to suggest that and I don't say this to minimize the pain and suffering of a lot of people, but, I haven't hated this time. It suits me. I like to spend time alone, and I like to be able to dedicate as much of my time as I need to my craft. So the pandemic hasn't been all that bad, but nonetheless, it was nice to have that time to just, I hadn't realized before I did it how important and essential really it was for me to have this step between working at home and then diving back into shows, is to rehearse in a venue for a week, get used to hearing my voice through, monitors again, to work with a technician again, like all these sorts of like the minutia of a day in the life of a working musician that would have all came crashing in really quickly if I had just like got in the van and gone to my first show coming out of the pandemic, if and when that happens. So that was really essential. So yeah, I just worked on arrangements for these compositions that I'm doing in the studio in Peterborough next week, wrapped up some lyric writing. I did a whole bunch of sort of experimental sound design stuff while I was in there as well, which sort of unforeseen has added this new layer to this recording project I'm beginning, where there's going to be more sort of field recordings woven in as sound design as part of this record I'm working on. So that was a really cool, unexpected result of this time, that it pushed me further into experimental sound stuff. There was a funny day while I was there. There was a big thunderstorm that week, and there was a big leak in the roof of the lobby at the Grand. And I came in and the staff were they were so apologetic. They're like this, they have these big fans going to dry out the carpet, and the alarm's going and the water's rushing in, and they're like, we're so sorry that if this is interrupting what you're doing, maybe you can come back another time if this really screws up your day. And I thought, this is perfect for me. And I went and got my handheld recorders and set them up all over, and ended up taping an hour of those ambient sounds, and then brought them back into the theater and spent the entire day creating a piece using that stuff. So I actually got to do something that was site-specific and immersive while I was there. And it really galvanized this developing interest that I've had in that sort of experimental sound production.
That's really cool. Yeah, no, you definitely caught my ear when you started talking about sound design. What other sounds did you incorporate? Like, I really like this kind of experimental thing you're talking about. Any other sort of interesting sounds or unconventional elements that are going to be in the new music?
Yeah. I mean, this project that I'm beginning on Monday is a body of work. It's part of a body of work that I've been working on throughout the entire pandemic, that I began almost like the first day of lockdown back in March 2020, where I just knew that, like the pandemic began right after I celebrated being 1 year sober. And, here I was, ready to go on tour again, finally in good health, and, sort of legitimately good health, no real threat of relapse or anything like that any longer, because I had the support in place finally that I needed at that time. And, just ready to take the world by the tail, and then everything just shuts down right away. And I knew that for my own mental health, and again, not out of fear of anything catastrophic happening, but just to stay focused and keep, the tools sharp. And I began a writing project where I wrote one song about every house or place or institution that I've ever lived in my life, and I ended up writing 39 songs as part of that. And it was a great experiment. It was therapeutic. It was cathartic to sort of like do this sort of like narrative therapy work on my past and reconcile some things. And so because so we're going to be recording about 14 of these songs in Peterborough, and because it deals with place and space in this really sort of hyper-specific way, I've been collecting recordings that sort of relate to those themes of domesticity, the general idea of home, that sort of thing. And those are all going to be tied in. I did some cool recording about a month and a half ago. I went down to Georgian Bay and brought my handheld recorders with me, and I'm a new hiker guy now. I took up hiking I don't even know what I call myself. But I got into hiking over the pandemic because I got a dog at the beginning of the pandemic. I got a 6-year-old husky rescue, and he needs to walk. So I got really into hiking, and, part of that was like listening to music a lot. And then I had this funny moment where I listened to a lot of, I really like ambient music. I like experimental drone music, and often, or not often, but sometimes some sort of ambient new age music can incorporate field recordings and nature sounds. And I caught myself one day, I was deep in the woods up in Muskoka, surrounded by the beauty of nature, surrounded by the beautiful sounds of nature, with my earbuds in, listening to nature sounds, and just had this moment of like, maybe I should just listen to what's going on around me as a practice in mindfulness, right? And I decided to take that one step further and start recording things. So I went down to Georgian Bay and got all sorts of cool recordings, and particularly I was there's a lot of lighthouses down there, so I was sampling, recording percussive sounds off of lighthouses, so hitting them with drumsticks, hitting them with mallets, hitting them with my fist, and then I've been building percussion tracks out of that as well.
That's cool.
So that's one example, yeah. And it's, I think that we have right now, our sort of culturally, our society is really visual focused, right? With, the rise of social media, that sort of thing. And most people, myself included, sort of reflexively, compulsively reach for my phone whenever I see something cool. But I'm not a photographer, I'm a musician. And so now I'm trying to apply that same sort of instinct to sound. So if I'm walking around and I hear something that sounds beautiful, I record it. And 99% of the time it's just a file that sits on my computer that I might never listen to ever again. But it's been a really positive practice, and it's sort of meditative and practicing a sort of mindfulness that I didn't really possess before the pandemic. So now I get to, sort of dovetail my newfound love for hiking and this practice of recording things while I'm doing that and bringing it into my, recorded studio work as well.
I'm glad you touched on the audio versus visual kind of thing. And this is, I don't want to make this too much about me, but that's the battle I'm always fighting. We talked a little bit earlier about sort of my work in the sound industry, and my main thing is audio branding, and we always think of brand very visually. Yeah. I'm always trying to get it into the auditory, because the sight is only one of 5 senses, right? There's this whole other world of stuff, of sound, and not just sound, but there's just so many other things happening and so many other elements that you can draw upon. So I'm glad to hear that you're sort of appreciating, sort of the broader kind of scope of the world in that regard. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I can't help but shake the feeling sometimes that time's a little limited on this planet, right? And I'm super grateful to be in good health, and I like to experience my senses now. I like to be able to actually take it all in. And I had an experience when I was a kid, when I was like 3 or 4. I was born cross-eyed, and my right eye was fully turned in when I was born, and as I got older, my left eye started turning in to compensate. And so I had to have corrective eye surgery, where I had to have patches over both my eyes for a number of months at this really formative age. And I can't help but, there's a part of me that sort of pathologizes that that is where I don't come from a musical family, but I think that's where I sort of developed my ears, right? Okay. And, I feel sometimes like I also have some other heightened senses. I was describing this to a friend the other day, and she was like, "No, that's not what happened. You're just a musician because you're a musician. You don't need to get too poetic here." But I think that it's there are there's a lot of examples in nature of one sense being lost and then other ones being heightened, and so this is sort of like that, right? I'm not losing my sense of sight, but I'm losing that impulse to try and capture everything visually all the time, because for me, my ears are more responsive than my eyes, and I would rather have those memories. I'm sure you both know what it's like to listen to a song that was your favorite song, summer 15 years ago, and it just transports you right back there. Yeah. It's incredible.
Well, the thing that I'm always preaching, both professionally and personally, is quite often visuals convey information, sounds convey emotion. Mm-hmm. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. Like when you watch a movie, they do this thing with students where they will take a portion of a film and they'll show them just the visuals. And what you get is kind of a sequence of events, but without any sort of emotional context. Then when you do the opposite and you isolate just the soundtrack, the sounds, the music, etc., just the audio component, you don't always know what's going on, but the emotional narrative is very obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, try watching a horror movie with the sound off. Not scary at all. Not scary.
Yeah, I think it was Hans Zimmer. Was it Hans Zimmer? There was some composer who said, if you're watching a scary movie, don't close your eyes, cover your ears.
Yeah.
I have a question. You had set music aside for a while. I think your words were that you'd left music, mm-hmm. and for a time to heal and get well. And it sounds like you've done a tremendous job at that. But when the time was right for you to pick up music again, how did you approach it differently? And I wanted to know how did it help in your healing journey as well?
That's a good question. I appreciate that question. I think it's important to clarify, I didn't leave music to heal. I left music to spiral into chaos, and it wasn't a choice, right? It was just the way things went. So I found myself in a place where I was ready to heal. and where I was ready to get serious about, recovery, where, music just hadn't been a priority. Music wasn't within my grasp. I didn't play music. I didn't listen to music. I didn't go to shows. I didn't really hang out with musicians anymore. There was no music in my life at all, really. And so when I sort of got back on my feet, I tried a few different things. I picked up a trade, and tried a couple different things, and just nothing resonated with me the way that my work as a musician had in the past. But I had apprehension for obvious reasons, that like Kingston's not the only place where most venues serve a lot of booze. But I'm fortunate that when I finally did have an experience, when I did begin the process of healing, I think it's hard to describe to people who haven't experienced it, but a flick got switched in my head, and booze and drugs were they're off the table. They're not on my radar any longer. So I'm grateful and lucky, and I know this isn't the case for a lot of musicians in recovery, that I'm just not triggered by the presence of alcohol around me. It just doesn't bother me. I don't necessarily like hanging out with large groups of drunk people, but that's not a judgment. It's not very much fun when you're sober. So, I'm a musician, and I have my entire life revolved around music for as long as I could remember. And that doesn't just go away. So much of the, when my life was spiraling and sort of descending into misery, my priorities got all messed up, right? So it's natural that, and that it wasn't something I was focusing on, nor was it something I was capable of focusing on. But it makes sense that when I had some clarity and I was clear-headed, that music immediately became a priority again. And I took baby steps at first. I had been out of the game for so long, there was no the sort of industry-facing stuff. There was no social media really when I was playing shows before, when I was performing before. We used, I think, Facebook to sort of do events and stuff, but that was about it. Twitter wasn't really around then. There were no streaming services then. I think I'm of that last generation of people that when I was booking a tour, I got on the phone and I looked in the phone book. I guess I looked on the internet. I'm not that old, but looked on the internet for the numbers for venues in different places and got in touch and booked tours that way. And things had just completely changed. So naturally, I had to kind of take slow steps. And, I was carrying a lot of baggage with me. I was carrying a lot of insecurities. I don't feel this way any longer. But in some case, I felt a little hard done by the music community. I think that there are a lot of places and communities that really encourage consumption and encourage, the widespread use of drugs and alcohol. But then when you cross that line, nobody wants to have anything to do with you anymore. And that was something that was a big chip on my shoulder until I realized that really wasn't the case. People have their own lives and their own stuff to manage. So I had to do that sort of thing, right? I had to shake off these insecurities and these sort of sort of resentments that I had that weren't actually real. And that's a process, that just doesn't happen overnight. The moment where I really realized that I needed to just start playing music again, not necessarily professionally, not necessarily for an audience, was there was a concert at the Grand, actually. It was Jeff Tweedy from Wilco when he came through town.
I was there. That was a great show.
It was a great show, yeah. And I'm not particularly, a Tweedy or Wilco fan. I like them, like him. But, it's not, I wasn't particularly inspired by his performance or anything, although he's great. But, I went with a friend of mine who's a musician who I hadn't seen in a long time ago. And we went out for dinner and we talked about music. And then we went and watched the show. And then we, went out afterwards and talked about music some more. And it just reminded me of the positive side of the experience I had had. And I realized, sort of for the first time that the vision I had for my life when I was 18, 19, that had sort of that wasn't in the cards any longer, and that folks who maintain that vision sort of into their 20s, into their 30s, generally don't make it in the business, right? And something I really observed in my peers who were still at it was everyone had taken care of their baggage, right? People were wellness oriented. And I think health and wellness is a really great metric to sort of determine my own, I guess, success, for lack of a better word. I feel that I'm successful when I feel happy and healthy, right?
Well, that's really interesting because I feel like the implied message is the opposite a lot of the time, because we associate rock music with debauchery and all this other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really identify as a rock musician.
Yeah, but musicians
I play
in general,
music,
yeah,
yeah, for sure. But I mean, that's that's Hollywood, right? That's and I'm sure I know that exists, but it's not not the folks I'm working with. I was, and to sort of go deeper into what you're asking about, like what role did music and being a musician play in my healing, is that it became this, sorry, I can't remember the word. Playing music again while sort of just reestablishing my life in general informed my health as much as, my developing health informed, my ability to perform and make music again. And it became symbiotic. That's the word I'm looking for. As I started playing more shows, I met so many great new people, reconnected with old people. And, there's nothing better than sort of reconnecting with an old friend on equal footing and meeting new people and traveling again. And again, in baby steps. I wasn't doing any major tours. And I definitely had some sort of unrealistic expectations about how things would go. I think I came back thinking there was this audience who had been pining for me while I was gone, which of course was not the case. But, these sort of like, these moments where, you just have to sort of like a reality check, I guess, for lack of a better word, was all really great. And it just allowed me to, as it developed, to just feel more and more increasing like, this is what I need to be doing. This is how I need to be spending my time. And I was, just sort of serendipity. I met some folks through some music channels, or I guess some theater channels, but got signed to a small record label out of Ottawa, which was host to like so many great bands from all across Canada. And just met so many people that way. Did my first tour in a really, really long time, went up to the Yukon and back. And all of a sudden just had this community of people who had my best interest in mind, not because they necessarily knew about my past, but because they're good people who have the best interests of their peers in mind at all time. And I have not found myself in a situation since I've returned to music where I'm stuck at a party I can't get out of. I'm not in a position where I have to pull one of my bandmates out of a bar at last call or anything like that. It's not sustainable, So the folks that I'm working with now, I think it's a bit of a myth, I think there's definitely, there are those pockets of the music world, the rock and roll world for sure, that really endorse that sort of thing, but it's not the dominant narrative, I think, because it's not sustainable. Yeah. I remember when I was in like partying a lot on the road in Europe in my early 20s, and I'm partying like a rock star. But when you don't have the budget of a rock star to like pay for the damages at the hotel, it doesn't last very long. People don't want to have you around much longer, that kind of thing. Yeah. And the music landscape has changed so much. You two know that as well as I do, I'm sure, that the sort of like, there really aren't rock stars anymore. It's not done the same way that there once were. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's a sort of renaissance of this DIY spirit that I love so much in the democratization of music making through like more accessible software that folks can use now, music consumption through streaming services, which of course I definitely have some criticisms of, but I also think have been really positive in increasing accessibility to music.
I wanted to ask you, your collaboration has always been something important to you and the way that you make music, perform music. And who are your collaborators? Who are your collaborators here in town? Who are some of the artists that you're working with locally that may or may not have been participating in your residency at the Grand Theatre?
Well, I've been lucky to work with a lot of different people in my time in Kingston. I think that one of my sort of greatest creative pleasures and probably one of my greatest creative strengths is that I love to say, here's this one interesting person and here's this other interesting person, and they've never met before, but I need to get them in the same room at the same time. And I guess, to play my music, but there's something about the energy of sort of introducing, sort of finding this diverse collaborators who don't necessarily on paper have a whole lot in common. But when I have a suspicion that something might happen, I love to pursue that impulse. So I've been lucky to have a number of projects revolving around my work, around my songs that have seen that sort of
chemistry experiment.
Yeah, chemistry experiment, exactly. Yeah. So right now I'm working with locally. I work with folks in Ottawa. I work with folks in the Yukon. I'm headed out to Halifax again in a few weeks to work with a group of musicians out there. But in Kingston right now, Terrard Frost, who lives on Wolf Island, who is, just sort of a Renaissance man, polymath.
Shisham and Lotus.
Yeah.
Among other things.
Yeah, I played with Jenny Whiteley for a while.
Mm-hmm. Maybe a member of the Gertrudes, possibly.
Yeah, I think he's in that orbit for sure. We met I guess sort of during the pandemic, we had been aware of each other for a long time, but just connected when Kingston was in the green zone and we had the opportunity to meet together. Our mutual friend Josh Lyons, the local filmmaker, connected us for basically just a little video project. And, we're thick as thieves now. He's, he and then Jason Mercer, who's a recent transplant to the area. He's working with all sorts of folks here. I think he's doing a bit of work with the Gertrudes as well. He's got a studio over on Wolf Island, and he was another new friend who, has become a really close friend and a close collaborator. I've worked with Liam Cole, drummer and percussionist, and multimedia artist as well. Liam grew up in Kingston. He's played with all sorts of bands here over the year. He's played with some pretty reputable Canadian bands, done some fairly significant touring as well. He was one of the first people I met, and I owe Liam some credit too. That around the time that I was, where I said I had that experience where I went to that show and sort of caught a glimpse of it. I had met Liam too, and we started just, talking about music as friends, and like there were all these sort of elements in place at that time that sort of provoked me to pursue it again. But those were the main folks. Now I worked with David Parker, Slowman Tofu. He and I have worked together quite a bit. Shan Alcorn has played in my project, and I've backed her up before. Dana Perceau, who used to be based out of here in Wolf Island. We did some work together. We're doing some more work together this week in Peterborough. And then, I've been lucky to work with a lot of the younger musicians. I've been connected with some Queen students that are recently graduated Queen students a couple of years ago. Local musician Michael Broadhead, who's a bassist, cellist, really extremely talented musician. I've worked with him quite a bit. Yeah, just this real sort of Matt Rogalski, someone I've worked with quite a bit. Derek Harrison is somebody that I've had the privilege to work with as well. Just, I tend to, whoever's just in my orbit, just sort of like, grasp onto them and, get them in a room and make some art with them. And, it keeps me energized to have new people around all the time to work with. And, increasingly it's sort of a consistent core group. But I've also got so many irons in the fires as well. Like I said, I'm recording this record this week, but I've got a whole other album that's done and in the can that's going to be coming out beginning relatively soon to release before I even really start thinking about this next one. So I'm starting a project this week that's probably going to come out in like 2024 or something like that, all with different artists. And, it's exactly the vision I have for my career, my practices, just, ongoing widespread collaboration and always working on letting go of my sort of micromanaging impulses and really just trying to have total sort of equity with my collaborators to try and create environments where folks feel that they have the agency to pursue their own creative impulses and the autonomy to contribute what they see fit without me necessarily dictating what they do. And I learned from that so much.
We've touched a few times on your new music, and we always make it a point to play something in the podcast by the featured artist. Is there a particular track you'd like to drop into the podcast?
Yeah, we can play the first track off of an album that I released last year. The album was called The Winter of Our Discotheque, and the song is called 1 Million More.
Anything particular you'd like to say about the track, or should we just jump into it?
No, I mean, yeah, that was I guess it's an important song because it was the first song that I wrote when I started writing music again. So it was the first song I wrote in 7 or 8 years. And it was one of the first, if not the first times that I started writing as sort of a therapeutic exercise, which has become pretty integral to my writing process now. And it sort of dealt with the experiences I had arriving in Kingston and sort of restabilizing and then falling back into illness. And, it's significant in that it was the first time I picked up pen and paper and started doing what I do.
I did not suspect coercion, only poorly timed perversion. You sang a different version when they found blood on your hands. Like the blood of your father and all the things he bought her. Now your story don't hold water. It's a habit and it's not a theme. It's a habit, it's not a theme. was hardly my competition. His motive and his mission called for absolute permission to put a bullet in his knees. As he tendered his resignation, he's earned this defamation. I'll buy a ticket at the station and take the train to Napanee. I'll take the train to Napanee. For the price of one Mercedes, you could run around with ladies that you knew back in the 80s, before your children had a choice. Before you hit your carny circuit, you swore you'd never work it. Your first million wasn't perfect. You went and made 1 million more. You made 1 million more. What's the moral of the story? Left me so conspiratory. What's the perfect allegory? I'm watching shadows up on a wall. I don't know you one iota. As you fly to Sarasota, I've already met my quota. I've invested all that I have. I've invested all that I have. There were flags right out the gate. I made the ordained way. Such a deliberate twist of fate. As sadistic as I am, when there's no one left to blame, I've got nothing left to gain. I've heard the song remains the same. I think I'll write 1 million more. I think I'll write 1 million more.
Thank you for listening to Kingston Live. Be sure to subscribe on your platform of choice and follow us on Facebook and Instagram. You can also hear our sister show, Kingston Live on Air, on Amherst Island Radio 92.1 FM and CFRC 101.9 FM. For show listings, artist info, and all things Kingston music, check out our new website, kingstonlive.ca.
We've touched on COVID a little bit here and there, and Michael, I'm really grateful to hear that your experience, and everybody's experience has been very different, but I'm really grateful to hear that your experience during all this has been both positive and very productive.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, and I think that I owe that experience to call a spade a spade. If I were still using when COVID happened, I don't think I'd be here anymore, right? I don't know how I possibly would have survived it. And I'm really grateful that this fell at the time, like, I mentioned earlier that it was a challenge at first to finally, like, I was 3 dates into my first major tour in a long time when things got shut down. And I was crushed at first, I was really, and I really sort of fell into, for like half a day into this sort of, isn't this just my luck sort of BS. And I'm grateful that I had a roof over my head and I had support around me. I had family back in my life. I have a great community, creative community, recovery community, all that sort of stuff. And my priorities had sort of been, reoriented in such a way that I just right away, knew, like I said earlier, that I had to not necessarily make the best of it, but remain active, that I had to, it's been this interesting experience where like life is just laid bare during this, right? Like we're just looking at the brass tacks of our life when we're stuck inside all the time. And it's really helped me identify like what are truly priorities in my life. And I had a lot of growing to catch up on because the second half of my 20s and the first half of my 30s were a wash, right? And so I was, really enjoyed the experience of like kind of for the first time developing like a routine, domestic habits, that sort of stuff, and have become so much more comfortable with myself and therefore a healthy sort of confident that I wasn't before. So on a personal level, that's been really great. But as that relates to music, like I think that artists can often suffer from some imposter syndrome, and I have been someone who's really, really suffered from that, and feeling like I had this catching up to do, and that all these other folks were so far ahead of me, without being exposed to in person, that sort of stuff. Really realized in a healthy and meaningful way that I'm not competing with anybody. This isn't a competition, and as soon as art becomes a competition, in my opinion, it's meaningless. We don't need to pit artists against one another ever.
Amen.
Yeah. And I think that really being able to have to, satisfy my own needs creatively in a way, find ways to collaborate, knowing that collaboration is essential to what I do, needing to maintain that, which is a learning curve, logistically and even just sort of emotionally, kind of figuring out how to manage that sort of stuff. But, because I had the resources available to me to remain stable, I was able to actually really focus on my work. So the insecurities that I've had about my work and my practice and, things that I really enjoy that aren't necessarily maybe very hip, or very cool, at least by my estimation of what I believe the public to think, which of course is meaningless as well. If I'm not competing with anybody, then why do I need to be carrying this sort of like, these insecurities with me? And it's really empowered me to just make the sort of work that I've always wanted to make the sort of records I know I would have loved when I was like 16. I love punk music. I love jam band music. I love experimental noise music. I love drone music. I love Broadway. I love musical theater, all that sort of stuff. And, really not feeling like this is anything that I don't need to keep any of these, these parts of my creative spirit hidden at all. And that in fact, if I pursue those impulses, that I'm going to hopefully achieve the longstanding goal of creating something that's relatively unique. And that's been just an incredibly empowering experience. When I'm this collaborative spirit that I often bring to my projects of sort of getting everybody I know into the studio, I used to be sort of insecure about. And I had peers who were not necessarily maliciously, but were a little sort of like, would kind of poke fun at me, when I'd go into the studio and be like, well, when are the other 30 people arriving? That sort of thing. But it naturally became sort of insecure, and just realizing in the span of the last 18 months that that's just how I do it. That's how I like to do it. That's how I'm always going to do it. And so I need to like lean into it hard, because that's what makes me happy. And that's what creates the best work for me. And that leaves me the most satisfied and the most sort of like energized to continue down that road, which as we've already discussed, is parallel to, health and wellness. So on a professional level, I've had so many opportunities come up in the last 18 months where I feel truly like a working professional musician now. You know, I have a publishing contract now, so I'm writing songs for other artists, which is a dream. You know, that I can. My 9 to 5 is writing music for other musicians. I love it. I love it so much. You know, little things like, you know, I'm hosting a weekly radio show on an online radio station now, which has just become such a wonderful part of my life. It really sort of, you know, has
It's
meant...
Frozen Section Radio, am I right?
Frozen Section Radio is the radio station, yeah. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the show that you're hosting?
Yeah, I host a show on Sunday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time called Electric Rabbit Radio Hour, which is really just sort of my favorite music. It's sort of moved into more new music, you know, just kind of keeping up with, you know, new releases that I'm really into. But I do some sort of, you know, there's no real theme other than my own taste. The name Electric Rabbit comes from a song by my favorite songwriter of all time, Vic Chestnut. Do either of you know Vic Chestnut? Yeah. You know, he's just my North Star, Mount Rushmore. And when I was, do either of you remember the music downloading service Audio Galaxy? Mm-hmm. So it was post Napster. It was the first web-based sort of music downloading service. And it was also the first one that had a service that was like, if you like this, you might also like this, which for like a nerdy 13-year-old me was just the greatest thing in the world. That sort of like, you know, that sort of music discovery. So, I was a huge this is a funny tangent to go down, but I'll keep going. I was a huge Smashing Pumpkins fan as like teens. They were my favorite band. And then using Audio Galaxy, this like short-lived downloading service, I was downloading all their B-sides, all that sort of stuff. And I got this song that was the Smashing Pumpkins and Tim from Red Red Meat and Caliphone covering a Vic Chestnut song. I'd never heard of Vic Chestnut before. And for that matter, I'd never heard of Red Red Meat or Caliphone. And it was just so different from what the Pumpkins did. And it exposed me to, you know, this world of like idiosyncratic outsider songwriters, you know, very sort of strange stuff. And it was the first time in my life where I like experienced that sort of very, I mean, not organic because it was digital, but like just my mind was blown. My concept of like aesthetic was sort of thrown out the window, and it really sort of dictated the way I love to trace lines through sort of music history and connections now. So I try to keep that spirit alive in it of like, you know, 13-year-old me discovering new music, not necessarily brand new, but new to me music. And so really just play anything that I get excited about.
As much as you are a recording artist, you're also a performing artist. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know if we can expect to maybe be seeing you live in Kingston at some time in the near future, and of the many venues here in town, which would you be the most excited to perform at?
Well, I would be most excited if 12 Cat was still around. That was a pretty incredible space. Wasn't particularly sustainable. And I would love to see the city implement support for those sorts of DIY spaces that aren't bars. And, you know, I like this opinion has nothing to do with me being a sober person. Like I said, I don't mind being around it, but I like to play for quiet rooms. You know, I don't spend all my time laboring intensely over the craft of lyric writing to have my work in a performance setting shouted over, you know. And I'm not saying that as a, you know, I'm not so precious as to think that that'll never happen, but I tend to not intentionally pursue performance opportunities in places where that's the case, just because it leaves me feeling a little empty afterwards.
You want a listening crowd.
Yeah, I want a listening crowd. Yeah. I mean, if I was making a different sort of music or coming at it from a different angle, then, you know, I'm not making party music.
Yeah.
I love going to a bar and seeing a party band, you know, where everybody already knows the words, so it doesn't matter if you can hear the singer or not. That's great. That's like, you know, that is so much fun. There are a lot of great, you know, bands in Kingston who do that sort of thing really well, and I'm not one of them, you know. And so I would love if there was a space, and hopefully there will be again one day, that you know, promotes and encourages that sort of, you know, listening audience. Would be really, really cool. I'm still feeling a little so about going back to shows. You know, there's still stuff going around. I don't want to be the one to pull the trigger necessarily, but I've had some offers recently, and I'm going to be announcing a tentative date pretty soon in the region, and it's looking like there'll be some Wolf Island stuff coming down the pipe pretty soon as well. In October, I'm going out to Nova Scotia and playing a series of shows with a ensemble that's based in Halifax called New Hermitage Ensemble, who are sort of avant-garde chamber jazz group. They do sort of like minimalist ambient jazz stuff. So I'll be performing my songs supported by them and their saxophone, guitar, cello, and harp. And I think we're going to intentionally not really practice too much because they're improvisers, which is going to might be my first shows back at it, which, you know, to me is pretty exciting. I'd like to start on the weirdest note that I possibly could.
Well, we're certainly excited to hear more of your recorded material and to eventually see you perform again.
I should also just shout out to KPP that I love KPP, and I think the shows they put on are amazing. They're the best people, they're the greatest.
Mark, if you're listening, that was for you.
Yeah. No, I just think I think that, you know, they are great examples of cultural producers in this community who, despite and occasionally maybe even in spite of a lack of resources and a lack of like particularly great venues for every type of music, work really, really hard at creating a scene.
So true.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I don't know what's coming up in Kingston, but eventually I'm sure I'll be putting my head together with KPP and doing something for sure.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I don't know how to exactly you want to end this off, or if this is
you were
the
going to
end.
end it. Yeah, that was it. No, Michael, thank you for joining us. This has been great.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's how you end it.
Great.
This has been Kingston Live. We encourage you to rate us on your listening platform of choice and subscribe where possible. Kingston Live was produced in Kingston at Titan Sound, hosted by Rob Howard and John Sanfilippo. Writing and research by Peter Sanfilippo. Voiceovers by Riley Jabor, hey, that's me, and John Sanfilippo. Promotional assistance by Jackson Coulter. Executive producer Rob Howard. We'd love to hear from you. Email us at podcast@kingstonlive.ca.